I am 75 after we buried my husband beside the walnut tree behind the meeting house. I found a coffee tin at the back of his workbench, wedged behind a mason jar of bent nails. Inside that tin, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, were 41 years of receipts, proving that the church had been paying my husband every single year on the 1st of April to remain my husband. And I want to tell you, before anything else, that I am not a woman given to exaggeration. I have milked cows in the dark and buried 3 of my own babies and sat through sermons in German I only half understood for 6 decades, and none of that prepared me for sitting on the cold concrete floor of a dead man's workshop reading proof that my marriage had a price tag. Because the way I always understood it, the way I was told it, and the way I told it to my own daughters when they asked why their father and I never seemed to laugh the way other couples laughed, was that Amos Bontrager had chosen me, plain and simple, the way a man chooses a good field or a strong horse, not because anyone was paying him a stipend to keep his hand in mine. And so you will forgive me if it takes some time to walk you through how a girl who grew up singing hymns in a one-room schoolhouse in Holmes County ended up, at 75, sitting on a workshop floor with cramped fingers and a coffee tin full of quiet, humiliating truth. But I promise you the answer to that title is coming, because I did find the receipts. I did read every one. And by the time I was finished, I understood my whole marriage in a way I never had while my husband was alive to explain it to me. So let me start where it really started, which was not with Amos at all, but with a boy named Elias Kanaji, and a summer I was not supposed to have, back when I was 19 and still had my mother's dark hair and my father's stubborn chin, the summer of my Rumspringa, when the bishop looked the other way as young people borrowed cars they weren't baptized enough to own and danced to radios hidden under hay bales. And it was that summer I fell in with Elias, who was not Amish at all, but the son of the English feed store owner 2 towns over, a boy with a laugh too loud for our quiet roads, and a way of looking at me like I was something worth looking at. And for 4 months I lived 2 lives, the daughter who milked cows and sewed dresses by lantern light, and the girl who slipped out after dark to sit on the tailgate of Elias's truck and talk about places neither of us had ever been. And I want you to understand, I never meant for anyone to find out, but our community was small, and our roads were straight, and someone always sees. And by August my mother had heard it from the Hochstetler woman at the dry goods store, and by September my father had heard it from 3 different men at the sale barn, and by the time the bishop called my parents to sit with him in his front room, the story had grown legs of its own. Some folks were saying I had been seen kissing an English boy behind the grain elevator. Other folks were saying worse, and none of it mattered whether it was true, because in a community like ours, the story people believe is the only story that counts. And my father, God rest him, was a proud man who had never once in his life had his name spoken with anything but respect, and the shame of it sat on him like a stone. So when the bishop suggested, gently at first, and then not so gently, that the matter could be settled quietly, that it could be smoothed over the way such things had been smoothed over before, my father listened with the kind of desperate hope only a humiliated man can feel. And the suggestion, as it was explained to my parents and later to me, was this: that Amos Bontrager, a widower of 34 with 2 young sons and a good dairy farm, but a reputation for being difficult, cold, a man his own late wife's family had quietly called hard to live with, would take me as his wife, and in doing so would erase, in the eyes of the community, whatever had happened with Elias Kanagi, because a married woman raising another man's sons and running a respectable household is not spoken of the way an unmarried girl caught with an English boy is spoken of, and I was never asked. Not really. I was informed. Sat down at our kitchen table by my father, with my mother crying quietly at the stove, and told that Amos had agreed to speak with the bishop about courting me properly, and that this was a mercy, that I should be grateful. And I remember nodding, because what else was a 19-year-old girl in my position supposed to do? And I never once asked, not then and not for 41 years afterward, why a man like Amos, who could have had his pick of unmarried women half his age, with no scandal attached to their names at all, would agree to marry a girl the whole county was whispering about. And that question, the one I never thought to ask, is exactly the question that Coffee Tin answered, because what I found, laid out in Amos's careful, cramped handwriting on the back of feed store receipts and old church bulletins, was a record going back to the very first spring of our marriage, a note that read, in his hand, received from the Deacons Fund $40 for continuing, and then again the following April, received $60 for continuing, and I sat there in that workshop with my heart going like a rabbit's, thinking surely I was misreading it, surely this was something else, some payment for milk or seed or land. But as I dug further into that tin, I found an actual ledger, a small green book with a rubber band gone brittle around it, and in that book, year after year, in a hand that grew shakier as the decades passed, was a running account, and beside each entry, sometimes just a number, but sometimes a note, for I, staying settled, or for keeping the household, or once in 1974, the year our son David was born sickly, and I nearly lost my mind with grief and exhaustion, a note that simply said, for hard year, extra, and I understood then, sitting on that concrete floor with my good dress bunching under me and my knees aching the way they always ache now, that my husband had not married me because he wanted to. Not entirely. He had married me because the church elders, led by that same bishop who sat my parents down at their kitchen table, had quietly arranged for a yearly sum, paid out of what they called the Deacon's Alms Fund, meant for widows and the genuinely destitute, to be given instead to Amos Bontrager, ostensibly as help with his 2 motherless boys, but timed every single year to the anniversary of our wedding, timed so precisely and continued so faithfully for over 4 decades that there was no honest way to call it anything but what it was, which was payment to keep him married to me, to keep the scandal buried, to keep the peace, to keep me, a fallen girl in the eyes of some, safely inside the fold, instead of becoming a cautionary tale that might tempt other young people toward the English world the way Elias Kanagi had tempted me. And I sat there for I don't know how long, long enough that my daughter Naomi came looking for me and found me on the floor with that tin in my lap, and she asked me what was wrong, and I could not even speak at first. I just handed her the ledger and watched her face change the way mine must have changed, and she said, "Mem, this doesn't mean what you think it means," the way children do when they are trying to protect a parent from a truth that has already landed. But numbers do not lie the way people sometimes do, and I had done the arithmetic already sitting there on that cold floor. I had added up 41 years of payments, small at first, a modest supplement no one would question, then growing steadily larger as inflation crept in, and as I suspect, my continued presence in that house became something the bishop's successors considered worth protecting at a higher price, and the total, when I finally let myself add the whole column, came to more money than Amos and I had ever spent on a single piece of farm equipment in our life together, more than we spent educating our 4 children, And once I had that number sitting heavy in my chest, I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was, I went back through my whole marriage in my mind, every quiet supper, every long winter where Amos barely spoke to me for weeks at a stretch. Every time I had wondered in the private dark of my own thoughts whether he loved me at all, or whether he had simply resigned himself to me the way a man resigns himself to a bad crop year. And I want to tell you something that surprised me, because I expected, sitting there with the proof of my own purchased marriage in my lap, to feel only rage, and rage did come, sharp and sudden, a rage I had not let myself feel since I was 19 years old, and being informed rather than asked. But underneath the rage, once it had burned through the first hot part of itself, I found something else waiting, because as I kept turning the pages of that ledger, I noticed the entries changed over time, not just in amount but in tone. The early ones were clipped, almost resentful. Received $30 obligation, Amos had written once, in 1971, in a hand pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through, and I remembered that year. I remembered how far apart we slept, how he would come in from the barn and eat without looking at me, and reading that word, obligation, in his own writing confirmed everything I had feared as a young wife, that I was a burden he was being paid to bear. But the entries did not stay that way. Somewhere around 1980, after our youngest, little Rachel, nearly died of the fever, and Amos sat up 3 nights running beside her cradle, without once complaining, without once mentioning the money or the arrangement. The notes in that ledger changed. That year's entry simply read, received, gave to I. For Rachel's doctor, meaning he had taken the church's money, the money meant to keep him tethered to me, and spent every cent of it on our daughter's medical care without telling me where it came from. And after that year, the entries grew shorter and shorter, some years just a number with no explanation at all, until the final decade of entries, the notes stopped being about obligation entirely and started reading things like for I. New coat, she won't buy herself one, and extra this year for I's sister's funeral travel. And in the very last entry, dated the April before he died, in handwriting so unsteady I had to hold the page up to the workshop window to read it clearly, Amos had written, "Last one I expect. Tell them to stop. She is not a debt anymore. She is my wife." And I sat there with that page in my hands, and I cried in a way I had not cried since we buried our first son, because I understood, finally, at 75 years old, 3 weeks a widow, that whatever had started as a transaction, whatever cold arrangement had been struck between frightened old men in a bishop's front room to cover up a 19-year-old girl's summer of foolishness, had somewhere along the way become something else entirely, that Amos Bontrager, hard and quiet and difficult as he was, had spent 4 decades slowly, silently, refusing the very deal he had been offered, redirecting money meant to keep him chained to me into caring for me instead, and had finally, near the end of his life, told the church to stop paying him altogether, because he no longer needed a reason to stay. And I will tell you, this discovery did not erase the anger, and it did not erase the grief of realizing that I had spent so many young years believing myself unloved, when perhaps I had simply been loved, in a language I did not know how to read yet. A language written in coffee tins and feed store receipts instead of the words English romances taught me to expect. And I have not yet decided what to do about the church, whether to confront the deacons who are still living, most of them younger men now who likely know nothing about an arrangement made by bishops 2 generations gone, or whether to simply let it lie in the ground with Amos, the way so many hard things in our community are simply let lie. but I can tell you that I took that ledger and those receipts, and I did not burn them the way some part of me wanted to. I wrapped them back in their soft creased folds, and I put them in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, beside my wedding dress, because a woman ought to know the whole truth of her own life, even when that truth arrived 4 decades late and folded into a coffee tin. And if you are wondering, because I know some of you will be, what I wore to bury the man who bought me, and then, somewhere in the middle of 41 hard, quiet, complicated years, decided to keep me anyway without being paid to. I wore the same dress I have worn to every important day of my life since I was baptized, a deep, dusty blue-violet, the color we simply call grape here, a color the Ordnung has always allowed because it is humble enough not to draw the eye and rich enough to still feel like something, and I plan to be buried in that same grape-colored dress when my own time comes. Not because the church paid for it, and not because anyone told me to wear it, but because after everything, after the arrangement and the receipts and the 4 decades of silence between two people who were never given the chance to choose each other honestly from the start, that color is the one thing about my life that was, and always has been, entirely and only mine.